That's interesting to think about, though, the problem of, like, saying, let's just watch our experience, right, is what they're doing, and try to see what are the irreducible elements that are there in our body and our mind. And that's what they're doing. And saying, we won't take it that the apparent integrity or wholeness of ourself is a given. We'll see what we can break things down to. The assumption here, and this is that people suffer unnecessarily because they exaggerate how real things are. They falsely impute a kind of reality to things that they don't have. That things have been built up into something more than what they are. The assumption is not that nothing exists or has its own nature. Of course, something has to really exist, and really exist by way of its own nature, as the foundation for building up these artificial constructions that we falsely become attached to. It's not at all. It's just, they just take it for granted. It just seems obvious that there has to be something real. It's just that that's not what we're seeing or getting at. And do you see what I'm saying? When I said the definition of ultimate truth, it's true nirvana is listed, but it's not like, okay, it's not the point is we'll realize nirvana and then we'll be free. No, the idea is you become liberated by seeing that realizing the lack of a self that you've falsely attributed to this conglomeration of conglomeration. But all of which ultimately does have an irreducible basis. That's the idea. I think it's important to think about that, because it's like we just like, oh, lack of intrinsic nature, and that's like not a given in Buddhist philosophy. I mean, all these Abhidharma systems just took it for granted that there were things that had svabhava and things that lacked svabhava, and the idea was to sort out which was which, and that people would suffer unnecessarily because they would falsely attribute some kind of real nature to things that didn't have it. But that didn't mean that nothing had it. Of course, some things have it. That's how that's why we get confused, is because we have some basis of imputation. There's some real things out there, and when we look at them, we superimpose on top of that some artificial extra thing that isn't really there. There has to be something real that's there, don't we? We feel that, right? We feel there has to be something real that's there, that's the basis of our superimposition. It feels like it ought to be out there, even though we don't believe this account of what it is, but we think that there ought to be an account that that says what things are in themselves apart from our telling a story about it. And this is their story about, like, well, there have to be these real things that are the basis for making up our superimpositions. So I'm getting you converted. But one of the things that's interesting is that they think. Well, I just want to point out a couple things about this. One of the things that I really like about this is that when they define ultimate truth and conventional truth, it's exactly in terms of mind from the very beginning. It's not, they say, we'll know that something is a conventional truth if the awareness of it does not operate after the thing itself is destroyed or mentally separated into other things. It's not like the whole it's not just like a unique thing to Prasangika to suddenly, or to Chittamatra, therefore to Mahayana, to suddenly begin talking about that the mind is important, right? This is in the Pali Canon, it's implicit in the other systems. They all take the mind as very important, and both in causing our problems and as being the training of the mind as the way to becoming free from our problems. And so their definitions of the two truths are not in terms of, let's set aside the framework of all that subjective stuff and just talk about, apart from that, what things are. No, it's like, well, conventional truths are those stuff that you can know that they're not irreducible. Why? Because when you break them up, the mind that was going X is no longer present, because the X has been destroyed. And you can think of, if you can imagine, space is an interesting one. So they think of, uncompounded space, like space that's all pervasive. They think it's like, well, if you break it up into parts, then what's left? Space still. You can't, there's not like some non-space part that space is built out of. No matter where you draw the lines through space, smaller and smaller, still what's left is space. So that's the idea. It's like you You can break some things up into smaller and smaller parts, but without losing the sense that, oh, there's that kind of thing. So a good example is of the same kind of idea is like, okay, so we think of, if we think of the cup as an instance of form, then the cup is a conventional truth, because when we smash the cup, then my apprehending cup is canceled. But if we think of it that this is form, then when we smash the cup, then we still apprehend form before, we apprehend form after, and we smash it smaller and smaller. So it's like not anyway. There's different ideas about what should be finally taken as once you have the definitions in place. I think it's fun to sort of play around with, well, what do you think should really be counted as irreducible, rather than going by the concept of what's irreducible, what's not irreducible, what is it that I can break up into parts and the idea of it just vanishes and seems to disappear? What is it that can be destroyed by reductive analysis? And is there something else that can't be? I think that's the idea, and you can then, if you have that idea, then you can try to see what things feel like they're ultimate truths for you, right? That seems like more interesting than saying what their specific list was to me. But okay, so that's one thing, and then the other thing I wanted to say is that so they think that ultimate truths, of course, ultimately exist, of course, right? Because the mind that looks to say, what is this really, what is this ultimately, comes only to it. That's exactly what we mean by something being irreducible, is that when you analyze it and look into it and say, what is it ultimately, what is it really, you don't come to something other than it, then that you come again to it, or it as its own nature. And so that's what it says. These irreducibles, primaries, drug use, things that exist substantially or in a primary sense, they exist ultimately, right? They don't necessarily. I think saying and therefore their ultimate truths could be a retrofitting of two truths vocabulary into the system. It's not clear whether they actually use that language, but that it's this is a way Vasubandhu defines it. Yeah. I think that I don't know what else I wanted to say about this. Let me see. Okay. So at the end of the chapter, I tried to think about what, and I already really said this. This presentation brings home the message that we have an ingrained predilection to see a gross sort of wholeness in ourselves, our bodies, and the external objects we encounter, failing to reflect upon the fact that such phenomena are imputed to a collection of parts. Consequently, in our mind, these things take on a solidity and substantiality which they don't really have. Conventional truths in this system are subject to disintegration, but we ignorantly apprehend them as unchanging and permanent. We mistakenly see them as independent realities, when in fact they rely upon the aggregation of things other than themselves. So they have this idea, they use the phrase for conventional truths, for the things that exist conventionally and subject to deconstruction, they use the phrase prajnapti sat, or daya, or they're imputedly existent things. So imputedly existent things in Sarvastivadi / Vaibhashika, imputedly existent things that are imputed to exist by mind, exist. But they exist in a non-primary way. They exist in a reducible way. They're actually said to truly exist because they can be appropriate. In other words, it's appropriate to say chariot in relationship to a collection of chariot parts, because it has, there's an appropriate designation of that in relationship to chariot. They would say it has the ultimate basis of being able to be called a chariot, even though we can break up the chariot into parts, none of which is the chariot. As there's a foundation for this, even though it's an imputed existence, they take it, they don't say, therefore it's canceled out and doesn't exist. And this, of course, has a lot of parallels, with what goes on in the Platonic system. Okay. Okay. Trying to think of what to do now. Yeah, you want to ask a question? I have a lot of other things to say, but I don't know, maybe too many things to say to fit into this class. Yeah. That's the same. Great exposition, great detailed exposition, Mahavibhasha. Yeah. Right, Vibhashika. I see. Great Exposition School is the translation in English of Vibhashika, and it refers back to the name of that text which the Tibetans didn't really have, but presumptively, that was the view that was in there. Yeah.
Did you say that Sravasti is more sophisticated than big scientists and theories? Ways you think it's something like contemporary science?
Well, there's something called scientific realism, which are sort of a naive scientism, right, or bad science with bad philosophy, where people maybe think that there's something real that exists in and of itself from its own side, that scientists have magically been able to go outside their own labs and own consciousness and discover from its own side. And, the problem is that is the way most scientists think, but they sort of can't help it because they're humans and that's the way we all think. And they have philosophy of science that tells them that's really not what you're doing. They probably all get exposed to it, and some of them study it more than others. I don't know. I think here's something that I've been thinking about recently. I don't know if it relates to this. It's like in science, there's all different kinds of science, right? And this is like well known, right? They have this hierarchy of the sciences in terms of, and it's like substance particles, conglomerate particles, and then like bigger things that are made out of those, right? So what do we have? Biology. Well, maybe there's something bigger. Anthropology, sociology, then biology, then chemistry, then physics. And then you have some, things that are kind of in between, right? Mathematics. Is mathematics like in the hierarchy below physics, more fundamental than physics? Yeah, it's the primary. So, yeah. Mathematics is a complicated one to figure out what to do with, but yeah. So each of these sciences has its own way of talking about or describing everything that's present in this room. And but the way they say it is like, well, these are different levels of explanation, and that so you can have true, legitimate models, working models that like pertain to the same space at the same time. You can have objects that are found by one science that are not discernible by another science because they're operating at a different level of explanation. But the idea is that there should be a way in which that it's not like they're all kind of like equal, but that if you really understood physics, then everything in chemistry would follow. And if you really understand chemistry, then everything in biology would follow. And if you really understood biology, then presumably everything in anthropology and sociology. I mean, that's the idea of reductionism. And that's the kind of, I mean, this is a reductionist system, right? It's saying there is something real. And so the idea is like, well, the concept, I think, that's implicit in that kind of, that there's not just different levels of explanation, but there's a clear hierarchy of these levels of explanation, is that there's some real things in terms of which everything would or could be explained if we could get down far. And the physicists are working on that right now. And they haven't found the conglomerate particles, but they found some other things that, you know, they have charm and strange and those things. They're just as strange sounding as the top and so forth. Yeah.
Really kind of lost it. Could you go back to describing the substance particles and what you meant when you said that they could be
Co-located?
To make another direction particle?
Yes.
This is all about the conventional truth.
Yeah. Oh, no, well, but these particles are ultimate truth.
The particle thing.
Yeah. Because they're irreducible bits out of which everything else is built. So the examples of conventional truth are pot and water, right. And I talk about cup and so forth. Examples of ultimate truth, you know, uncompounded space, irreducible particles, nirvana.
Just say about co-located things.
Okay, so, yeah, well, it's that they have directionally partless particles, but in order to have different types of directionally particles, you just have one type of directionally partless particle, then how would you build a diverse and complex universe? So they have different types of directionally partless particles, and what makes one directionally partless particle different from the other? Well, it has to have different parts, but these parts can't be physically in different places because it's directionally partless. So right, there's no east, west, north, south, top, bottom. So a directionally partless particle consists of 6 to 11 substance particles that are all in exactly the same place with each other, and by being in that particular, you know, set, being present, then that is what constitutes that directionally partless particle as being sort of part of my eye or part of a God's ear or part of that pine tree or something like that. You're having trouble with the idea that these little particles are all together in the same place?
I'm having trouble with this entire
this entire conversation, yeah.
Yeah, I can't get past the between irreducible and reducible and the fact that it's not made up by mind. However, if it's smashed and the apprehending mind is canceled, I do.
Okay, let me just go over it. Okay, let me go over it again. Conventional truth is the thing where when you smash it or destroy it by analysis, the mind apprehending it is canceled. Ultimate truth is the thing where when you tear it up or try to tear it up, you only come to it again, and therefore the mind apprehending it is not canceled. So that is what I'm calling reducible and irreducible. Reducible means subject to analytical reduction to something other than it. And irreducible means something that exists substantially, irreducibly in a primary sense, such that you can't break it apart into something other than it. Now, do you follow?
So that's the substance particles, uncompounded space, nirvana.
Yes, those are the irreducible things. So, well, yes, generally. But what I wanted to say, if you got that, is that it's a little unclear, like, okay, which of these particles, the substance particles or the directionally partless particles, are they counting as the irreducible things, right? So, you know, if you read this in here, I make the argument that it just really doesn't make any sense to say that the directionally partless particles are irreducible. But they seem to be saying that, but I don't understand that because it's obvious that you can mentally tear them apart into the substance particles even though you can't physically break them up. But they do seem to be saying that. So I wrote in the book, this is what they say, and then later on I said, well, you know, if we think about it and play around with these ideas, I mean, we don't have a complete list. We just have these little bits, right, of what they said. It's sort of a reconstruction. And so we can think of like, well, if these are the definitions, how do we think it would work in terms of things? And that's what I tried to do. And also, it's not just me. I mean, this guy, Malong Belden, this Mongolian Gillespie scholar, did the same thing. He has his book called The Two Truths and the Four Tenet Systems, right? And he goes through and he says, well, this is what they say, and here's some problems with it, and let's see, if we think about what they're saying, what would it seem to imply? I mean, that's philosophy, right? Yeah.
Are there other, like, things you do with your positive system is, like, widely accepted about,
Let me see. Well, this idea, I don't know. The other idea for which they're known, I guess, is this idea that, like, all these things of the past, present, and future exist. That seems to be, like, probably even more famous as an idea for them in this irreducible bit. Those are the two things that, and then there are other ideas. Okay. I don't know if this is a case of what you're asking. Another doctrine, which is not relevant to the true truths directly and is also confusing, is that they have an idea of causality not necessarily going with the arrow of time. And so that's kind of like what in Prasangata, we talk about fuel and fire, and we say, fuel is and fire are dependent upon one another reciprocally, but we try to make the distinction that fire arises from fuel in one sense, and fuel is imputed in dependence upon its relationship to fire in a different sense, but not as a cause. But they use the word cause to talk about. They just use the language of causality to talk about things that could exist simultaneously being causes of each other and things that exist after being causes of things that were before. But what they mean by that is not crazy. They mean a cause in terms of a necessary contingent condition for us to speak of such, I think. So do you understand? It's just like I guess you'd say opening our minds to thinking about the way that dependence doesn't flow with the arrow of time, but they use the vocabulary of causation, which of course causes all kinds of controversy. That's all I can think of. Maybe there's other things. Yeah. Okay, so if there are more questions about that, then let's say I just have a few, do I have a few minutes or not? Should I stop? What do I have? What should I stop? 11:26. When am I supposed to talk? Stop. 11:30? Oh, I don't have time really to do my lunch. Okay, you have another question? Oh, okay. All right, go ask the question then.
Okay.
All right.
So, back to the fundamental theism. So,
yeah.
And they had the Bodhisattva idea, they needed to have another Buddha in the future. But then you're saying that they didn't believe that every person had Buddha in the future?
That's right.
Okay. And then
that doctrine, as far as I know, appears in the Lotus Sutra, and you don't see it in. I don't know of non-Mahayana teachings about all having Buddha nature. Right. No. There are Mahayana sutras that have people of different lineages, 3 different lineages. Yeah. They're called Ichantikas. That there's some people. Yeah. That even in some Mahayana sutras, you have people who will never become Buddhas, people who will become hearers, people who will become solitary realizers, solitary Buddhas, and people who have the Buddha nature. So there's 4, possibilities for what your nature would be, and people would be interested in finding out. Then, you guys kind of have a Calvinist effect there. Right. No, that's what made me think of it. It's like, oh, that produces that anxiety to find out whether I'm among the elect or not, and that produces a lot of motive. That's the way that works. You know, it's like everybody's really anxious. I would like to feel that I have the bodhisattva nature, and so then you engage in behavior which tends to confirm that hope and encourages people, you know, to be more bodhisattva-like, lest they feel that they're the chantaka, you know, and they'll never escape from cyclic existence. Okay, go ahead.
And then in the personality, when you're talking about this whole particle idea,
Yeah.
talk about it as being yogic. So that gets to the idea that this was like conceptual people saw in their mind.
Yeah. I feel that, as I try to allude to this a little bit, I mean, I do feel that this is not like this isn't just like people sitting around thinking about it. This is like people doing insight meditation and describing what it is that they feel that they can get things down to. Anyway, I guess I can't prove that, but that's what people are doing. That's the kind. They're doing a practice. You know, they're not just like scholars. They're monks and yogis and meditators, and their practice is mindful observation of the stream of experience. And the idea is that you have this idea that we have some permanent self and some independently existing self. But then let's look, instead of let's analyze, it was like, well, let's look, let's watch. And when you really watch, you really pay attention, what do you see? What do you see? You don't see the permanent self. What do you see? And then this is the idea, is that they're seeing these kinds of things as the irreducible bits. That's the way I understand it, anyway. And I think, like all of these Abhidharmas, all the Abhidharma systems are like that. I mean, people. Now, it's true that some of the dharmas that the Abhidharmas enumerate may be things that people felt were necessary to add in order to make a whole system. But a lot of them are like, well, let's watch our experience really closely and see what we see and break things down into that. You know. But that's the spirit of the Abhidharma.
I was thinking that it could be the way you're saying that you have the experience and then they wrote the Abhidharma. I always had the idea that the Abhidharma constructed this system as a way to help the people who are meditating isolate what they're seeing in their experience.
Right. I think that's true too, but it's like, why would it not be the same thing? In other words, where would it come from? I think it comes from, they could go through the Buddhist teachings and make a list of all the different things he talked about in different places, I guess, and that's the idea. But I think it reminds me of this thing about the debate manuals, the Yiksha and Tibet. It's like, well, people go out and debate in the debating courtyard, and then they take those debates and they write them down, or they formulaically write them down into books, and then people learn them, and then that becomes the basis of debates in the debating courtyard. So I think obviously, there's the practice and study have this kind of cyclical relationship in Buddhism. So, yeah, I'm sure you're absolutely right. It's like you sit down to meditate. If you've read an Abhidharma text, then you have an idea of what kinds of things you're supposed to be seeing. And that would structure your experience by creating a framework for your insight meditation. I don't know, it was like, I guess if you were very well trained in the monastery, then maybe some people would have all these categories in mind when they sat down to meditate. But then other people might do insight meditation and not be told up front, exactly what you're supposed to find. Well, we don't, I don't think we know independently from what we can infer from this, like something about their practice tradition. They were doing, I would take it they're doing mindfulness meditation, because that's
No,
well,
I think it's because you could do the practice without all the Abhidharma stuff.
Right.
You can have the Abhidharma stuff, and then when you do the practice, it wakes you up to notice certain things that you probably would have noticed before.
That's how you know, he doesn't have to be done, just as opposed to doing anything analysis.
I think, I mean, all through the college canon is analysis going on.
Right.
You know, I mean, I've always seen that so often we have the idea now because of Mahasukayada.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
They just sit around and watch their breath.
Yeah.
But, you know, Mahasukayada is research.
Mm-hmm.
And the college canon is analysis running through and through.
Yeah. No, that's the point. Right. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that the idea of watching your experience and mindfully noticing what arises was not probably supposed to be separate from the idea of then also thinking about, well, what am I really seeing here? and maybe maybe you go back and forth between these two, but it's like if you're just constantly in a stream of observing instant by instant what arises, then what's the moment when you stop and reflect on what you've learned? I think you have to like say, well, you know, I was watching my breath and watching all these sensations, and they're flowing by like Don was describing, you know, the other day, and it's like, didn't notice any self in there, you know, and that has to be like a, you know, thought. Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, so it's like maybe about the other stuff I was thinking about, like coming back to some of the questions that we were talking about, we'll come to in the afternoon, and then maybe we can, depending on how that goes, we'll either start Sautronica or we'll do Sautronica tomorrow morning then. Okay? All right. Okay.